Well, now that the dream of building my backyard concrete mini ramp has become true, I figured we could start doing some mini ramp tutorial trick tips. But before we get into like any really difficult ones, also I don't know too many mini ramp tricks, so now that I have one, I got a lot of opportunity to learn them. I figured we'd go over some of the basics, the fundamentals of mini ramp. I'm not gonna go over the things that are already on YouTube. I'm not gonna be super redundant. Then hopefully by the end of this video, you can even use some of these basic trick tips and little hacks for other tricks that maybe you're working on right now. So first one, pretty essential one that we'll get started with is just the drop in. And my way for explaining these tricks is actually going to be to show you them and talk about the big mistakes, the common mistakes, and then we'll talk about like one big takeaway from each trick. Trial and error from my perspective and experience, essentially. The common mistake with dropping is basically bending your knees and not compressing the body with the transition equals a big old slip out. So what you really want to do is keep your head level with the transition and keep your head almost moving with the transition. And what I mean by like keeping your head moving with the transition is almost like your neck, right? I'm up here, my neck is going down, and then I'm leveling out. Sorry, I'm behind you. So I'll pretend I'm goofy. So if I'm dropping in, like, this is dramatic, but I'm going like this, and then as I go down, kind of leveling out. It sounds crazy, but I think it's something people don't really think about. It's like your head is sort of your pendulum on your skateboard when you're skating transition. So you always want to keep it sort of in motion, essentially. You don't want to be too stiff. So staying compact in the drop in is super crucial. I think it's just going to be a lot easier. You're closer to the ground, so less wipeout factor, essentially. Now, you really do want to focus on putting your weight on the back foot while leaning forward to balance out the weight on your board. Essentially, your back leg is like a peg. It's going to be a little stiffer while your front is absorbing the impact and guiding you into the direction. Last thing is thinking about it as a giant squat to absorb the speed and transition. This can seem really difficult, but it allows you to understand how gravity is pulling you down, but you can use the physics of your motion to counterbalance that pull. Get confidence with rolling up the ramp fakie and slowly pressing on your tail to get used to that body motion. And I think that will really like allow you to understand where your hips and where your head, where your shoulders, where everything really should be. So you can just simply roll up backwards and just press on your tail a little bit. That was sketchy. It's actually probably harder, but it gets used to the motion, you know? Find a little ramp like this, and you don't have to go all the way down. You can go up and just go. So you use that motion of adding some pressure on your back while moving your front hip in. So as I'm pushing down here, I'm leaning here to counterbalance that. I'm leaning on here, but I'm pushing with my head forward. So that's a drop in, pretty simple trick, but you need to know that. That's a fundamental for skating mini ramps. Now we'll talk about kick turns, front side and back side. We'll kind of just group them together. A pretty common mistake is having the back foot too high on the tail. When pressing on the tail, you lose your center of gravity and it's hard to balance the board from here. So you really want to have your back foot in the concave spot versus the end of the tail. It allows for more mellow lift versus a really heavy lift. What I mean by that, I'll show you an example, but like if you're way back here and you're lifting up, your board is so high, it's harder to control. So if your back foot's more in the pocket spot back here versus like being up here, you put it in here, you're able to control it a little bit better. And it's more of a subtle up. When you're back here and you're going all the way up, it's like you're doing a manual while you're turning. You don't really want a manual while you're turning. You just kind of want to use the concave in your trucks to sort of churn, put that pressure point. It's almost like back here. That's where a lot of your pressure point is on your foot. You don't really want your toes over for front side or back side. I think you kind of want your heel off the back end more so. Now, another really common thing that I think I see people do is like, you start pre-winding their hips for a turn, front side or back side. And really what you want to actually kind of do is think more about your shoulders, because your shoulders will give you the direction where you're going and your hips are going to follow naturally, because that's just how the body moves. So like if I'm trying to go that way, it's more like I'm dropping this front shoulder and lifting this shoulder up and I'm almost swinging it like that. And I'll do it right now without moving at all. Dropping this shoulder and turning. So your back foot is back here, that concave spot versus hanging over. Your front foot could be wherever really it's comfortable. I kind of have a little more on the heel. Front side, you kind of want to drop it down. Back side, you want to drop this side down. So whichever way you're turning, essentially. So for back side, I'm going to drop this shoulder, lift this one up, and I'm going to guide my shoulders versus guiding my hips. My hips will follow. Same will be for front side. Drop it, shoulders up, in. Pretty basic. Try not to lift those wheels too high. You can really power slide this one out. And the other thing is you want to go wide. I think too often people try to go like straight up and kick turn down. It's pretty hard, pretty dangerous, because it's pretty much like doing a pivot. You really want to draw it out. Try to go wider. The wider you go, the less hard it is to turn at the top, because you're like constantly making an arch and turning. Next fundamental trick, really fun one, is the rock fakie. So many different ways to do this. Like some people go on the very top, forward, some people deck it. I like decking it, it's actually safer in the long run. It's kind of funny how that works. Essentially with this one, it's like one of the first tricks you're gonna learn, because once you drop in, once you start kick turn, you're gonna start getting to the top of the ramp pretty quickly. So what a lot of people do is just kind of lift, and they kind of get there and then they get hung up and they can't really make it back down. So I think one of the biggest mistakes is people focus too much on going forwards versus going backwards and rolling back in. A lot of the times people will get into the rock but slip out when rolling fakie because your body is too forward on the ramp. You want to stay sideways so that you can drop your back shoulder when you're ready to go back in. Placement of the board is extremely important as well. It's going to be hard at first, but tapping in the middle of the board is actually the hardest way to rock fakie. I would suggest keeping the rock to fakie in the front or in the very back of locking into your base plate. I do suggest getting comfortable with rolling up and just lifting your wheels up and eventually lifting them up over the coping to get used to the motion of basically doing a backwards manual down the ramp. Lastly, you want to squat it out when in doubt. It'll seem really weird at first, but this is a good way to get comfortable with all transition skating. So basically, I'm rolling up and I'm lifting it up ever so gradually. Again, I think it's also important to keep that back foot not high on the tail, because like when you do that high on the tail, it's the same issue. Your board will go too high. You want it in that concave spot, just barely lifting. You can start low. You know, you don't have to hold it for a long time either. You can just do it for a second, just lift up like that. The reason this is gonna help a lot, because this is the hardest part, is coming out of the trick. A lot of times what I do too with like transition tricks in general, I kind of like try to reverse engineer them. So I'll think about the landing versus getting into them. Typically getting into the trick's a lot easier. So yeah, once you have that kind of, you get comfortable with lifting your wheels up a little bit and going down, really it's just about like getting the confidence to go up there and try to tap it, come down and just stay compressed. I think that's the one thing. You want to stay compressed when you're rolling down. A lot of times what people will do is like hit it, it'll come down and it'll zing back up that way. I think a lot of it is trusting your motion. You have to go drop that shoulder back down, backwards to right out. So like really focusing on the riding out backwards and just doing fakies to get confident is gonna be a big help. So now we'll talk about the fakie rock. Fun one too, to rock fakie rock. And there's a lot of different ways to do a fakie rock too. I'll show you somewhere I'm actually bonking off it, and then somewhere I'm just lifting my board over it. But one of the common mistakes with this one is like people get their back truck hung up and they get stuck and then they just have to run out. It's also pretty nice, like you see how mellow my coping is. If I just set my board right there, kind of shows you what I've done before is you can even start this at the top and you can kind of like slowly go in. You know, I'm doing that just to show you that like you really can't hang up on this trick. You can hang up, but it's more so about like making sure your body's in the right position, then you can't hang up. Maybe if you're really light, you can, because you don't have like that weight to kind of push you through the coping. One of the common mistakes with the fakie rock is people will often get their board over the coping and then lock their back truck up when trying to roll back into the ramp, mainly because their weight is distributed wrong. You always want to keep your weight on the inside of the ramp versus going up on the deck. When you're rolling up to a fakie rock, you want to keep that front knee a little more bent than the back knee, so that when you end up in the board position, you can roll back down to regular. So that way when you're rolling up fakie, you kind of want your foot right here, and you almost want your foot to be sideways. The point being is like, it's kind of like a roll versus just like pressing on the nose and trying to get it over. You're actually kind of just using the side of your foot. Again, you don't want it way up here, it's more in this middle spot to kind of press it over. And that helps you get out of it. Getting into it, whole another story, but just getting out of it, having that spot right there and just rolling your ankle ever so slightly will get that lift without having to move your foot too much, because the thing is, as soon as you get that lift, you can roll your foot back to flat and be in a nice solid position. The big takeaway with this one is just like making sure you're in the ramp and keeping that shoulder dropped as you're in. Also, it doesn't take much, like to pop it, really, it's just about actually putting less weight on your back, and it kind of just pops. And it's more about keeping your front and your feet essentially over the board so that when it does pop, you can land it back on there. It's definitely one of those things that's gonna take a little while to get like that board control essentially, but you can always roll up just like a rock fakie, similar to like the process of coming back in. So it's like use that rolling of the ankle type of thing this way, get it back on there, and then again, back down. And I think that just tiny little roll on your board really allows you to have more board control, and you're not lifting super high, so it doesn't feel as dangerous. And yeah, it's gonna take a couple hang-ups, but that's a really fun trick. You can also even grab the nose. Some people start on the deck and they make their way in. There's so many different ways to go about this trick for sure. One way, here, I'll try one real quick. The back grab. You know, one thing you could do too, like some people do this, look up there, you go all the way to the deck, you can almost grab your toe, as crazy as this sounds, and you can like sort of see how it's gonna go in. I definitely don't suggest doing that unless like you're comfortable. It's probably actually a lot harder than just doing a Fakie Rock, but the point is like, you can just see how the board, where it's at, and where your body motion, and essentially like where you distribute your weight. Now the next trick we're gonna get into is the axle stall, and then we're gonna get into frontside and backside scratch grinds. The axle stall is a pretty crucial one for transition skating as well, especially for mini ramps. It's a good way to get speed for any other trick too. One of the common things though that I see people do is like they'll end up on the top and they'll get stuck because being up here, you know, is a lot harder than like being down here. So that's one of the first things I'll say is like, try not to think of an axle stall as like being up here and think of it more being in the inside. At least for me, that's how I go about it. As soon as you're up here, it's so much harder to get into the transition essentially. You can start from the top of the deck versus working your way in. However, I think it's a lot more scary for most people versus working your way up. When you're rolling up for an axle stall, it's a lot more straight up and down versus a scratch grind or kick turns. One thing that's really helped me is pointing with my front arm of where I'm actually going, where I'm locking in, and when I'm rolling away. Something I used to do when I was younger, I would try to almost power slide off the coping into the transition to turn out. So essentially like I would go up, get in there, and then instead of just turning out right away, because there's this lockup factor, right? Like that's scary. You're on the deck and you turn out like that, you could definitely hang up. So I think when you're in the inside, it avoids that hang up factor. If you turn from here and you're in the inside, the back wheel right here is gonna pop you out. So like right when you do that, right when you turn that back wheel, hits the coping, it's just gonna pop you right out in there. Where if you're up here, you can definitely hit that back wheel and hit it and then come in. It's a lot more of going up here and in, where if you stay in the inside, it's just a lot more mellow in general. I think that's like one of the biggest things. And also just scooting in, you don't always have to lift super high. I think that's a common theme probably in this video is like not lifting your board super high, because that's when things become a lot harder. It's harder to just balance it in general. So yeah, just go like this. Like that was really dramatic. You don't have to slide out like that, but it's about just staying on the inside a little more. Getting that back truck on there first, tap the front, turn. So yeah, getting that back truck in there first is crucial too. I think that's like one thing that's a big takeaway is like try not to get both trucks on there. Get that back truck in there, tap your front one for a little bit, but keep all that pressure in the back. For the final trick, we're gonna focus on the front side and back side grinds. Common mistakes with this one is turning straight up and down and expecting the truck to get on the coping without hanging up. Just like kick turns, you really wanna make sure your foot placement is in a position where you have the most control of the board. Bigger wheels and a wider truck is going to give you more clearance on your grinds and allow you to have less hang up on the coping. Never try to push your board weight into the top of the coping. Ideally, you want to push the weight to the other side, whether it's front side or back side, pushing out of the grind versus going into it. So you're not really trying to grind for a long time, you're essentially making a big arch. Focused on the departure of the grind versus getting into the coping. Essentially think of backside and frontside grind as a big kick turn arch that hits the top of the ramp. The coping is just a bumper cart railing to push you back in. You know, it goes back to the kick turn. It's like pretty much doing the kick turn, but you're just going up higher and you're arching it out. You could do the tape too for this. This is really helpful. It's starting to rain, so I'm gonna get a few real quick. But yeah, basically this one's like, my ramp's not super big, but I'm gonna start on one side and make my way all the way over here, all the way over here. And I'm gonna work my way up, you know? I'm not gonna go straight into it. It's a big angle. Every time it's a lift. All the pressure's on my back foot right now. My front shoulder is just guiding me. It's all on my back. Same with backside. I'm gonna drop my back shoulder and lift my front shoulder. And really draw it out. There you have it. Let me know what tricks you want to see next down below. I love you, Mash.